And now, let's give a warm Curiosity Club welcome to Jeffrey R. Elliott, Lutherie.
Thank you, gentlemen, and welcome, everyone. It's really great to see this turnout. I'm glad you could make it. My talk tonight will highlight my restoration of two of history's most important classical guitars, an 1869 Francisco Gonzales, and more significantly, in 1888, Antonio de Torres. I'll also address the ethical concerns that led to decisions that determined the specific treatments, and I'll show photographs of some of those treatments, as well as some of the investigative methods I used to understand their history in a forensic sense, which was equally important. After I sent out these invitations for the talk tonight, I got an email from a friend who was quick to point out the association of crime with forensic investigation. And he wondered if I'd be revealing evidence that there was a crime committed associated with one of these guitars. I assured him that, to my knowledge, the only crime committed was in the sometimes abysmal treatment, poor repairs, and negligent stewardship that was perpetrated upon these instruments, and that my use of the word forensic was in the more general meaning of investigation in order to discover the history of these instruments. So a lot of you already know what luthier means. In fact, I think half the crowd here are luthiers. But if anybody's in doubt, it's an old term, about 400 years old. It's from the French, and it means lute maker. But when I started my apprenticeship 50 years ago, hardly anybody knew what the term meant. In fact, I remember going to a gathering where a lot of new people were meeting each other for the first time and exchanging business cards, and I handed my card to this person who looked at it for a few seconds, and then he said, "Well, I'm religious too, but I don't advertise it." Well, I still find humor in that, and when I think about it, after all this time, he wasn't that far off. This might be a good place to explain the difference between what I call normal everyday guitar repair and historical guitar restoration. Normal repair is an art, and it requires certain methods and procedures, which I'm very familiar with because I've done over 7,000 of them. And I use all of those in historic restoration. But restoration also carries additional responsibilities that require a more elaborate approach to work with additional techniques and procedures, primarily intended to conserve and preserve, not necessarily to make an instrument look like new or as if something hadn't happened to it. Additionally, it also imposes a degree of ethical considerations not commonly associated with normal repair, and I'll address those shortly. I'm often asked, why bother? Why spend all this time and money on these old guitars? And I thought about a half a dozen reasons, actually, and any one of them is sufficient all by itself. There's the intrinsic value of the object itself. It is a handmade musical instrument and the result of human endeavor. There's a sentimental value. A lot of people love their instruments for a lot of different reasons, and it's very difficult to put a price on that. They bring beauty and joy of music into our lives. And there's the monetary value. A lot of these older guitars are worth several to many thousands of dollars, and they're worth more if they're kept in good condition. So there's an investment to protect. And there's the historical value, especially if it's a rare or a special example, which is also difficult to put a value on. And for me, especially with these two guitars, it was a personal choice. I considered it a privilege and an honor and a supreme opportunity to pay homage to Gonzales and Torres. Earlier, I mentioned the additional responsibilities of the restorer, which I've listed here as a sort of credo. First is do no harm. It sounds a lot like the physician's Hippocratic oath, and it's not much different because we never want to leave an instrument worse than we found it. It's enormous responsibility, not only because of its sentimental and monetary value, but its rarity and irreplaceability make it a responsibility to history. We want to preserve the originality of the instrument as much as possible. In order to not leave our footprint, we must disregard our own sense of craft and aesthetics in order to honor that of the maker and to do work that blends in with the existing craft. Next, everything must be reversible. If 50 years down the road somebody decides I did the wrong thing to one of these guitars, they can back up and reverse what I've done and carry it on out. In order to be reversible, we have to use a glue that's water and heat soluble, and we use hot hide glue. Hide glue is an organic glue. It's made from the hooves, hide, and bone of cattle mainly. And it's water and heat soluble, and it has a working temperature of 145 degrees Fahrenheit. So a little heat, a little water, you can undo something. Clean it up with water, start over, no harm done. The other thing we use is French polish. French polish is better known as shellac, but it's also the name of the procedure or the process of applying it, the old traditional way that's hundreds of years old with a cloth, a cotton cloth. And my partner over here, Cindy Burton's an expert in that, and if you have any questions about French polish, she'll probably be the one who gets tagged to answer it. But it is also reversible because it's alcohol soluble, and we can use alcohol to soften it up, remove it. It's also very easy to touch up for that reason. Next, we save everything. And I mean everything, every splinter, even things we think is not original, because someday somebody might decide that it is, and they want to back up and put it back on. And it's all part of the provenance. It has to go with the instrument. It accompanies the instrument wherever it goes. And then we document all the work, and that seems like a no-brainer. We keep a journal, write everything down. I also do a photo essay, and I take photographs of the before, the during, and the after of the work. Again, not just to cover my butt and to document things, but for provenance. Again, if somebody down the road needs to back up to a certain point, they can see exactly what I did all along the way. Research is very important. We want to know the history of the instrument's owners and its players, any records of repairs, and we also want to know the maker's method of work, his or her theories, aesthetic sensibility, and even their label design, and how this may have changed over time, so that by dating the instrument, we can place the guitar on this continuum and make the correct decisions about the work to be done. Again, all of this becomes provenance and accompanies the instrument. And ethical considerations are also very important, but not as clear-cut as you might think. As it happens, whenever anybody asks me to do a repair or a restoration, I always ask myself two questions. First, what's best for the guitar? And second, am I the one to do it? People bring instruments to me for reasons they think it needs something, and very often that is the case. They do need that, but they may need something else too, because very often with classical guitars, one thing is linked to another thing. And so I look at the whole instrument in a holistic way and try to be sure to treat the whole package and do what's best for the guitar. Then there's the matter of sometimes I'm not the right person for the job. There are some people who specialize in areas of our work who do what they do better than I do it, and if it's a really important instrument, I'd be happy to refer it. And I always refer the French polishing to Cindy. Looking over these two guitars, when I consulted with colleagues and museums, institutions, private collectors, I was literally staggered at the range of responses, because some said that they wouldn't touch it at all. They would just leave it the way it is for all its history intact. And even if it meant that it would continue to decline and deteriorate, they wouldn't even maintain it. And then others would have been fine with replacing the entire top and doing a total refinishing, which is the other end of the spectrum. Most people fell in between there, but they were all over the place. And so I had a dilemma. In addition to a total lack of consensus, I had to consider the possible repercussions on my reputation if some of the powers that be in this profession decided what I had done was not right and they were vocal about that. It wouldn't necessarily go so well for my reputation. On the other hand, I didn't want to confuse others' expectations with what I felt was right or what was right for the guitar. So in the end, I decided that unless I agreed to be employed under somebody else's standards and policies, it boiled down to a personal decision between me and my client, and it had to be one that I could live with. And it also occurred to me that every instrument made today might one day become an historical artifact if it survives, including my own. So I asked myself, how would I want my guitars treated, say, 150 years from now, by some future luthier? And the answer is no different than I hope they treated it today. However, I do think that it's right for a singularly rare, special, or valuable guitar to be preserved for posterity with all of its history intact. And if either of these guitars was the only one in existence, I would have refused the work for that reason. But these guitars were certainly valuable and also rare. They were not the only examples by these makers. So I agreed to restore them to fully functional condition and as closely as possible to their original design and aesthetics. This is the 1869 Francisco Gonzales after I restored it. Gonzales lived from 1820 to 1879, and he was important for several reasons. He was a contemporary of Torres, and also a celebrated maker in his own time, whose guitars won several awards. He was a leader of the Madrid School of Building, who used both the old concepts and some of the newer ones, representing the transitional period before the designs of Torres became fully established. He taught the brothers, Jose and Manuel Ramirez. Manuel made Andres Segovia's first great guitar in 1912, and Jose established what's now a family regime in its fifth generation, which has also built guitars for Segovia. This Gonzales is only one of 5 Gonzaleses known at the time I did the restoration. This is the 1888 Antonio de Torres after the restoration. Torres lived from 1817 to 1892, and he was highly celebrated, innovative maker whose instruments won several awards and even praise from the Queen of Spain. There was lots of experimentation going on in the early 1800s in the Madrid School. At about 1850, Torres was the one who put together all the right variables with some ideas of his own in the right combination and proportion to make the classical guitar louder, more sonorous, with greater dynamics, and a broader response range than ever before. This was all very timely because it met the needs of players performing in larger halls and of composers writing new music that required these responses. The great Spanish guitar maker and scholar, Jose Romanillos, wrote an excellent book on Torres's life and work, and it contains a gallery of nearly 90 known and authenticated guitars of an estimated 320 made, which is less than a 30% survival rate. This is one of the guitars in that gallery. His basic design has remained the foundation of classic guitar construction over 160 years. His guitars were played by all the best players of the day, and he had long associations with many, but none longer or more significant than his 40-year association with Francisco Tárrega. From 1869 to 1909, Tárrega owned 3 Torreses in that period. Francisco Tárrega lived from 1852 to 1909, and he was a prodigy who acquired his first Torres guitar at age 17 in 1869. He also owned an 1883, but he preferred this 1888 guitar the most, and he played it until he died. He became the premier guitarist, composer, and teacher of the last half of the 19th century, and he's credited with bringing the classical guitar and its music into the 20th century. He developed a method of playing that remains the foundation of guitar technique today, and his music remains very much in today's concert and recording repertoire. The value of this 1888 guitar is magnified by the history of the combination of who made it and who owned and played it. For example, last weekend I just was talking to a dealer on the phone who informed me that the 1883 Torres guitar that Tárrega owned just sold for around $300,000. Okay, X-rays. X-rays are valuable investigative tools. These X-rays are of a 1943 Hermann Hauser Sr., which were taken in 1975. Hermann Hauser Sr. lived from 1882 to 1852 and was a great German maker who is revered only second to Torres. There's an interesting story as to how these X-rays came about. I had a dear friend named Dorothy who lived in Los Angeles who owned two Hauser Sr. guitars, this 1943 and a 1948. And she invited me down there to document those instruments, which I immediately did. I spent 3 days with those instruments on her dining room table. And about the second day, I was musing about how nice it might be to have X-rays of these instruments. It might tell us more. Well, Dorothy taught guitar, and she had a student who was a radiologist at LA General. She made a phone call, and we were invited down. So we each grabbed a guitar, and we headed to the LA General. We wandered through the corridors, making our way to the radiology department, and I saw these people lined up on the wall, waiting to see physicians, and I started feeling kind of guilty about taking up space with guitars. And we got to the radiology department. I was introduced to Dorothy's friend, and I expressed my concern, and the friend said, "Oh, don't worry about it. We're using this X-ray. This machine is obsolete, and we're going to get rid of it, so no problem. You're not acing anybody out." And we proceeded to take X-rays of these two guitars. And the X-ray machine is had only about a foot diameter field of view, so I had to take two images to get one good one of the top. And we did a couple of both guitars, front, back, sides, head, and neck. So we had a series of them to do. We're about halfway through that series when there was a shift change in personnel, and Dorothy's friend left with one of the technicians. A couple of new guys came in, and they just resumed as if it was the most normal thing in the world to X-ray guitars at LA General. And we were nearly done with the whole procedure when in comes this older gentleman looking fairly stern in a white lab coat, and everybody froze. And nobody said a word. And after a while, I stepped forward and introduced myself, and then I introduced Dorothy. And then I introduced the guitars, and I told them why they were so important and significant, and that we thought that maybe X-rays would be revealing from a building standpoint. And he said, "Let me see," and he grabbed one of the negatives, put it up on the light box, and stood there looking at it, and I went over to him, and I told him that we could see the precise location of all the interior bracing of the back and the sides and the top, and that it revealed an architectural design as a kind of skeletal support system. Then, looking a little closer, I pointed out that you could tell that the grains were all vertical grain, which meant that the wood was quarter cut, which is optimum for the strength and tonal quality and longevity. And that we could also see over here, there, and all these little light areas in between the curves, that we could tell from that Hauser used hot hide glue when he put this guitar together, because the glue, remember, is made of hooves, hide, and bone, and the calcium in the bone shows up like bone on an X-ray. So after I finished, he turned to one of the technicians and he said, "Make a duplicate set of these for the department," and he left. Right? Well, he got to the door and he turned around, he looked right at me and he said, "This never happened." Okay. This is the inside of the 1869 Gonzales. It's in a mold, and I'll talk about the mold in a little bit. But it's up here to show you the common way the back was assembled. The guitar is upside down, it's face down in the mold, and the neck and the sides and the top are all attached. And the way we assemble, most of us assemble backs now, and a lot of people back then too, was to put the back braces on the back first, and then fit that to the rest of it and glue it down. But Torres, among a few others, would do it another way. They would take the back braces and glue them, notch into the linings over here, glue them in place, and then use the hot hide glue. They have to spread it over all these surfaces all the way around and on the braces and on the foot of the heel and the M block. And then they just put the back down on there and put pressure on it until it cooled down and the glue set. And the way they would do that pressure is to wrap rope around the instrument across its width, and then use wedges under the rope pushing downward on the outside of the back over the areas they wanted pressure, over all these braces and the blocks. Sometimes with that much gluing, where you started applying glue would cool too much for a good joint. And you'd end up with what's called a cold joint, which is an unreliable joint. And what they would do to correct that is, this is the back, three-piece back of the 1888 Torres. And what they would do is, again with the rope and the wedges, but they would take a cloth and soak it in alcohol, swipe it over the areas they wanted to heat up, and then light it. Right? Now the alcohol would burn for a minute or so, which is hot enough to transfer through the wood to the glue, heat the glue up enough, and then shove the wedges home under the rope and put the pressure on it until it cooled. And you have the joints just as good as it would have been if it was good the first time. So also on the sides of this guitar, you can see light colored bands right at the waist, and that's because they use a hot pipe to bend the sides around. And if they took too long to do it or the pipe was too hot, and that's the most acute bend on the side, so it does take the longest, you would get these light colors where the heat would bleach the color out of the wood. Now this is yet another guitar. It's the interior of an 1882 guitar attributed to Torres. It's unauthenticated. It wasn't in Jose's book. But I'm using it because it shows the way the back braces were locked into the lining here and the unique method that Torres used as opposed to other people. The brace is not scalloped on its end. It's pretty much retains its height all the way across. That in itself is uncommon. Most people scalloped. But apart from that block on the end of it, the brace itself is tapered in its height, so that the widest part is on the bottom. That's what's glued to the back. So it tapers up like this. And Torres would cut the lining to fit that taper exactly. So there was a little pocket there that the brace fit into. And it would only go in one way from the back because of its shape. And it's also the only way to get it out. So this guitar, this 1882 guitar, came to me for restoration. A physician who was retiring from practice owned it, and he acquired it when he was 16. But when he got into medical school, he didn't have time to play, so he put it in the closet for around 45 years and never did anything. It just kind of went south. So this brace came completely loose from the back, and it had been loose for long enough that it lost its arch. Right? They're arched across the back, so that the arch on the back is reflecting that. And this had flattened out, and I had to get the brace out of there, re-arch it, and glue it back in again, but I didn't want to take the back off the guitar. So what I ended up doing was cutting that kerf there all the way, the rest of the way through the lining, and removing it. It was made with hot glue. I could get it out of there with a hot palette knife, and took the block off the end of the brace, and then I was able to, the brace was already loose, I just pulled it out, re-arched it, re-glued it back in place, and then put the kerf piece back in and the little block on top, and I didn't have to take the guitar apart. Right? This is the mold I mentioned earlier. I used it on the Gonzales. The traditional way that molds are made in the violin world is where that comes from, is with plaster of Paris. And it takes a while to do it, and once it's done, it takes about, for a violin size mold, 3 weeks for all the moisture to evaporate out of it. So a guitar size mold would probably take a couple months, right? And it's also harder to modify the mold. The Gonzales had a double S configuration along its length on the top. It should have had a nice long arch across and lengthwise, but instead was pulled up behind the bridge, dished in front to the sound hole, and then up again and then down before it hit the neck. So I needed to reconfigure the mold to reflect the original arching that I wanted to reestablish, and to do that in plaster would have taken a long time. And I thought it would also be very heavy. So I thought, well, if I used what's called flotation foam, it's used to put in the hulls and under the seats of boats to make them more buoyant. And it's got a lot of air in it, and it's rigid. And the way it comes is in two, it's like an epoxy in a way. It's two-part mixture, and you mix it together, and it expands to 40 times its volume, okay? It happens pretty quickly. Once you mix it up, you have to be ready to put it where it goes. So I lined my mold, which was slightly larger than the Gonzales, with plastic, and I lined the Gonzales with plastic, covered it, mixed up. You can figure the volume that you need to fill, and you can mix the right amount of this stuff so it fills it exactly. And mixed it up, put it in the mold. As it started to expand, I put the guitar in there, held it in place. It only took a couple minutes, and the foam came up all around, filled all the void. Right? This instrument fit like a glove in there. You could take it out and put it back, and it would be in the exact same spot every time, which is what we wanted. And this also allowed me then to easily reshape the mold to the arching that I wanted in the top. And where I had to add material over here and here, I just mixed up some more of that stuff and put it in. And then over here, I took away material by easily sanding or scraping. And I had this whole mold done in an afternoon instead of a couple months. Right? This is the same guitar in the mold. And I took out the fan bracing, which somebody had. This is some of that abysmal stuff I mentioned earlier. Someone had just really whittled it down to practically nothing, and it would have imploded under string tension. There was no point in trying to keep it original for that reason. I took it out, and in order to encourage the top to remember its arching, I used what's called conservator's felt paper. And what it is about 1/16 of an inch thin. And the bottom layer is actually Gore-Tex material. It's a thin sheet of Gore-Tex. It's got little bitty perforations all throughout it. And the upper layer is what you see here, is a kind of thin layer of cotton felt. It's very absorbent. And you just have to moisten that felt side and then place this down where I did in this top. And the moisture will go into the wood in the form of vapor. It'll humidify the instrument without making it wet or damp. And that softens the wood fiber, makes it more willing to go into the shape I wanted it to. Here, on top of that, I used, looks like a litter of puppies, doesn't it? But it's sandbags. I made, each one of these sandbags weighs 4 pounds. I heat it to 150 degrees and then put them in the guitar on top of the stamped felt paper. And I'll leave it in there until it's cool and then do it again. Well, I do this 3 times a day, all day, leave them in all night for 3 weeks. And when I took it all out and took the guitar out of the mold, it had remembered the arch, right? This is the inside top of the unauthenticated Torres, the 1882 guitar. And you can see that there's a crack here that's been repaired. There's a couple of cleats over it. And then there's some other stuff going on here. It's kind of messy, gluey, smudgy stuff. It's kind of hard to know what's really going on. This is the same area under black light, the ultraviolet light. And under ultraviolet, the calcium in the hide glue shows up light colored, like bone does on an X-ray. So we can tell also the fluorescence of this glue under this light dims over time in exposure to atmosphere. So the brighter stuff is more recent, and the dimmer stuff is older. And over here we have what I think is original glue from the assembly when it was new, and likewise this bar and the glue there. This is very bright. It's kind of messy, but very bright, and I think that's much more recent. And this smudge right here, if you look in the middle, you can see there's a pencil line that runs full length. And Torres was known for, among other, well, a lot of people did it too, but Torres was known for drawing pencil lines as the center for the braces. And if this is one side of the guitar, you're not seeing all of it. The center is over here. This was originally a 5-fan guitar that was converted to a 7-fan guitar. And you can tell because this stuff here is not as bright as this, but it's brighter than that. And this was converted probably just before 1960 when my client got the guitar. So it wasn't exposed to the air, that glue, and that's why it's still a little brighter than the original stuff that was done at the same time that had been exposed over there. Okay, this is the underside of the top between the sound hole and where the neck meets the body. And it originally, of the 1888 Torres, and it has 9 cracks all along in there. This is after the repair. And the two main cracks were on the outside of the fingerboard, and you can see them from outside of the guitar. You could have dropped a coin through them because there was a big gap. And so I took the fingerboard off that part of it over the body, and then I took a section of original wood out of the top, and I filled those 2 cracks that were visible with original material, and then I put in some old European spruce I had to make up for what I'd taken out. Now, 9 cracks deserve more support than these 2 bars going across there, but I didn't want to make it too unoriginal. At the same time, it did need some support. Normally, in normal guitar repair, you'd probably put a thin layer of wood in those areas, and that would have done the job, but it would have been overkill for this guitar, and it would have been too big a change, I think, from the originality. So what I did was use parchment instead. Parchment is, another word for it is vellum. It's skin, quite literally, and it comes from the soft belly area of calves and sheep. And they scrape it down very thin. It gets down to about 0.2 of a millimeter, which is about 0.008 of an inch. And being skin, if you use hide glue with it, they molecularly combine to form this homogeneous, very thin, very strong, rigid layer. And so this thing is only 0.008 thick, and it probably weighed maybe a gram altogether with the glue and the parchment together, and it reinforced all 9 of those cracks without it adding much weight or mass at all to it, and it's totally reversible. This is the label of that guitar, the 1888. This is before the work. Remember, it had a 3-piece back, and the joints on the back separated very severely at one point, and it cracked the support strips on the inside of that joint. You can see some of the crack right up there. And of course, the label being glued on over that was torn apart at the same time. Somebody, before I got it, really smeared a lot of glue in there. I took the whole guitar to the Portland Art Museum, where a paper expert named Elizabeth Chambers was able to take the label out through the sound hole, repair it. And while she was repairing it, I had determined that the original strips that were in there that were all broken anyway were not original. And I took them out and I put in new strips. And then when she returned the label to me, I glued it back in place. Here we have, guess who? Francisco Gonzales. Remember him? He's playing the 1888 guitar. The photo on the left was taken in 1895, and it shows him smoking while he's playing. Now, he was a compulsive smoker, and he was famous for it, and there's reviews of the performances of the day that say how wonderful he could do entire passages with only his left hand, and that he even allowed himself the luxury of smoking while he performed. Well, the trouble with that is that live ashes would fall off the guitar onto the side of the guitar, and these live coals would burn through the finish and into the wood. And all 3 of his guitars have evidence of this on the side, where he just didn't care about that. The photo on the right was taken in 1901, and you can see that it's later now, and you can see that there's wear here and here on each side of the fingerboard, even in this faint photo. And that's where he's worn away the finish, and the oils from his hands have gotten into the wood and darkened them up. And he's not smoking in this one. But if you look here, that's a cigarette hanging off the 3rd string. He's got it within easy reach. So he's always got one at the ready. If it's not in his mouth, it's at the ready. And the trouble with that is that heat from the live ash would rise upward. And over time, it would crack the ivory grips on the gears. And this first gear grip, this is after that 1901 photo sometime, had been replaced by somebody. It's kind of crudely made out of plastic. It actually did work, but it wasn't suitable to this instrument, and it wasn't original either, so I didn't feel badly about replacing it. I made a replacement out of mammoth ivory. Now this is the top of that unauthenticated 1882 guitar that you saw parts of earlier. And after working on it I became pretty familiar with it, and I began to feel that it really was an authentic Torres because it exhibited much of Torres's craft and methodology and his aesthetics. And the date and style of the label suited the timeline, and the penmanship on it matched the penmanship I'd seen on other labels. And then finally, to me, the work itself had the look and feel of the maker's hand, and I'd seen that in many of his instruments too. Now, several experts I consulted with about this also agreed, but they were unwilling to commit to it without actually seeing it in person, and most of them were in Europe. It made it kind of difficult. Then one of the experts I talked with referred me to an English violin maker named Peter Ratcliffe, who was also a specialist in dendrochronology. Dendros from the Greek meaning tree, chrono, time, logy, science, so dendrochronology. Peter had amassed a large data bank identifying the top woods of historic violin family instruments and classical guitars. And from a photograph of the top, he could identify the species, the age, and the geographical region of growth. So with this photo, he was able to identify the top as alpine spruce from a common source of the day in what is now Italy. And I could see that this is not a book-matched top. And what I mean by that is usually most guitars in the world are made from the top of them is made from one piece that was either split or sawn in half so that when you open them, like a book, each half's a mirror image of the other. And these halves are not mirror images of one another, not even close. So, I mean, there's some things that are similar, but they're not close enough, even within the variance of what Mother Nature does. So I knew that this was not a matched top. And Peter was able to determine that the bass half was from 1842, the treble half from 1834, making these woods 48 and 40 years aged, respectively, when the guitar was made. And here's the kicker. The treble half was a match for a known authenticated Torres from 1867. So that confirmed for me that this was a genuine 1882 Antonio de Torres classical guitar, and that made my client very happy. So, any questions? All you luthiers out there?
So one thing I noticed was that when you replace the reinforcement strips on the inside, that one guitar, I think the Torres with the label that was conserved. So the reinforcement strips were not, the grain was not running perpendicular.
That's right.
It was running with the grain
Yeah.
of the cap.
I maintain that those weren't original anyway, okay, the ones that were in there. But Torres was known for doing both. And the vast majority of them were done with the grain going crossways to the joint, so it was stronger. But he did do some that with the grain going with the grain at the back, and inevitably many of those split with the movement of the joint. Right? So I made a judgment to put this in the way he did most of his, which is cross grain, which is stronger anyway. Okay. Yeah.
So with when you select materials, so like say you're replacing those parts, or you're gonna be like making a piece of wood to go into a crack, do you try to find like antique woods to replace it with, or are you using modern woods?
Yeah, I keep some woods on hand that are very old too. One of the, which one was it? We used the 1901. It was on the Gonzales. The bracing that I took off in the lower bout, the fan bracing that I took off on the 1869 Gonzales, I replaced with wood I had gotten from a violin maker friend of mine that was from 1901. Right? So I used very old material, and the parchment that I used on the 1888 under the fingerboard area is from 1885. And I acquired that through another local luthier, Wesley Brandt, who was in England at the time. And at that time in London, they were switching over all these old ancient scrolls of parchment of public documents to microfilm. And as soon as the stuff was on microfilm, they just wanted to unload the parchment, and they were selling it by the pound. no pun intended. And I did buy a pound of the stuff, and I use it on these old instruments because it's appropriate. It's from the time.
So you've been making guitars for 50 years now. Do you find, do people ever take your guitars to a luthier to get them fixed, and are you ever like critical without naming names? But are you ever like, oh my God?
It doesn't happen very often, I'm happy to say. I'm pretty vocal about letting people who I know own my guitars know that I want to be the one to work on them. And most people respect that. Occasionally, somebody takes it upon themselves to do something that I may have to redo or undo. Yeah. When instruments of mine change hands, which after 50 years they do, I also prefer that people bring them back to me so that I can get them in their top condition, just for their own sake, but also in preparation for resale. They'll be at their best. And the new steward will start off at least with the instrument in its best condition.
Are these historical guitars that you've restored, are they being played now, or
Oh, yeah.
are they museum pieces?
Yeah, we heard both of these, the Torres and the Gonzales, Cindy and I did just early January, and they sounded great. In fact, I should tell you, if you don't already know, I think Gregory, you know, that there's a new book out by Sheldon Ehrlich. It's the second edition of his earlier book from 1997, and it's about his collection. It's called A Collection of Fine Spanish Guitars from Torres to the Present. And the first edition, which was a really good book, had about 60 some instruments. This one has 88 instruments in it. And along with, and it's a very much better book, a lot updated information-wise and really good new digital photos. And there's 3 CDs that come with it, 2 classical, 1 flamenco. And there's something like 75 of the instruments represented on those discs. You can hear them played. And they were all played without enhancements, so you get the real actual sound of the instrument. You can compare them. So yeah, they're playable, and they sound real good.
Jeffrey, in one of the photographs that you had where you were depicting the back brace getting interlocked into the kerfing come-on area, I was wondering if that was one of those 2 guitars or if it was just an example. Because it looked like it had kerfing.
I think I said at the time that, I'm going to get to that picture. It's wrong. This one?
Yeah.
Okay. This is the 1882 that I said at the very beginning of this, that it was the unauthenticated 1882 Torres, the one that eventually was authenticated at the end. Right? But I have it in there as an example of how Torres, this is one of the reasons that made me think this was a Torres, how he put his back braces into his linings. Not many, I don't know very many other makers at all that use that method. They often would put their backs on by putting the back braces on the instrument first and then gluing the back over that like a frame, just gluing a skin over a frame. But Torres locked his braces in this way where they were tapered in their height and they could only go in or out in one direction. And that's why taking it out was so difficult until I thought of cutting through the curve.
Jeffrey, I had a question about your comment about the top, remembering its arching, just kind of restoring the arching before you redid the bracing. What is sort of the nuance between forcing the top to do sort of the imagined curvature that they probably had originally? I guess I'm looking for more of a comment. How do you know where to put the arching back? Because you have to make a decision at some point in the form.
As I said, this is one of 5 existing Gonzaleses in the world, known at that time. There's one in the Paris Museum, which is probably the best example. And I wrote to the museum, and I got the curator there to send me the documentation they had. So I had the reference of those archings. And then there's a few other, one was in pieces in Felix Manzanero's shop, and one in the Ramirez collection, and one in another private collection. And you could piece together that's the forensic part of this, piecing together this historical information so that you get a picture of the past, what was done in the past.
So after all of those 4-pound puppies that were with the sandbags,
Yeah.
After you went through that period of several weeks, when you pulled out the bags before you attached the bracing, so the arching was smooth and kind of
Yeah, uniform and conformed to the reverse arching that I put into the mold. Yeah, yeah. It didn't. I don't like to think of it as forcing it. I just kind of encouraged it.
Sure, no, that's amazing though, that the S shape went away.
Yeah,
You were talking
yeah.
about
Well,
that.
part of that was removing the bracing because the bracing had taken on that deformation as well, and so getting rid of that was a big step toward that freedom of movement to go back that way.
So your sensitivity to the past craftsmen that you honor, you are a craftsman yourself. In 100 years, when a luthier is looking at your work, what philosophy or technique would you want them to recognize and honor?
Well, I hope that they're experienced enough to see it in the instrument, right? To see the craft. I've written about my building philosophy, and it's published. In fact, a lot of these people that are in here tonight already know that. They're Guild of American Luthiers members, as I am. And the stuff's public knowledge, actually. If somebody wants to really research it, it's out there. They can get to it. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm not. I don't keep a real detailed journal of every instrument with a lot of my intentions and this and that and the other. I do record weights and dimensions and things that are maybe different or ideas I had at the time, but I also keep a photographic record of the inside of all my guitars. You know.
Is there anything ineffable that you're honoring in some other craftsman? Like, you're very sort of measured and tactical, you know, and very
Yeah.
researchy. Is there a spirit to it?
Yeah, I mean, of course there is. Tapping into it is the trick. You know, kind of channeling that maker, you know, or what their intent was. If you can at least do that, then you're in the right direction. If you look a lot of their instruments, very few of them have done any writing or leave anything in the way of journals. You have to look at the instruments, and that's what I mentioned earlier, a timeline. If you see early instruments in their career, and then middle ones, and then later ones, you can kind of tell the direction they took it, and you can kind of surmise a thought process along the way, you know. And then the instrument you're working on at the time has a date that you can plug into that timeline.
So in terms of the instruments that have been authenticated, is that because there's documentation of who's owned them throughout history, or is it
Especially with really valuable instruments. There's a lot known about most of them, who owned them through history, and not always the early repairs, but certainly once they became valuable, the provenance that goes with them would have this information. Yeah. Is that what you were asking?
I guess, I'm curious how much documentation the makers made. It sounds like they didn't record much of the process, but is there a record of all the things that they made?
Well, the makers themselves didn't keep much of a record, these old Spanish guitars. Back then, some of these guys were famous in their own time, but most of them were just trying to make enough money to feed their family. And Torres was known for being destitute for his whole career, even though he had praise from the Queen of Spain, you know, and he'd won all these awards and everything. There was a period in his time, in what's called the first and second epoch. There's a period in the middle there where he and his wife owned a china shop because he couldn't make enough money as a guitar maker. Right? So, the book, Jose Romanillos' book that I mentioned earlier, it's Antonio de Torres, His Life and Work by Jose Romanillos. And this book is very good. Jose spent over a decade researching Torres' life, and it's not just his instruments, but his life. And he has a lot of information he gleaned from letters and correspondence and talking to relatives that survive now. Some of this, that's what it takes to get any information at all, usually, if you don't get it from the instrument, that stuff from the instruments themselves.
Where did you learn to become a luthier?
I apprenticed in Detroit, Michigan from 1966 to 1972 with Richard Schneider. And he had worked with Juan Pimentel for a couple of years in Mexico City. Carrie?
I had another question about this Torres up here. It almost looks like that the back brace is flat saw. Is that?
Yeah, it is. And that was a common thing that Torres did too.
You saw the back braces are?
Yeah. Sometimes the top harmonic bars were too.
Oh, really?
Okay. What type of testing did you do with the expanding foam material? Or did you use that for your mold?
Testing with?
The expanding foam that you used.
Well, I did do a little testing. You luthiers would be, if you don't already know this, I made a wooden frame that had a top that's hinged, right? I lined the whole thing with clear cellophane, and then mix up the stuff, slam the lid shut, and clamp it all around the periphery. And then the foam expands and fills that area. And it doesn't take too long before it's set, and you can unclamp it, and you got this block of this foam. And you can use those to make calls with. And I make bridge calls and all kinds of calls with it. And this calls for clamping so that the clamp itself won't mar whatever it is that you're wanting to put pressure on. And it can also be conformed to irregular shapes. So you can shape this stuff very easily. So you can go over strange bridge configurations or bracings and that kind of stuff. So I made a sheet of this stuff, figuring that it would be useful as call material if nothing else. But it works like I thought it would, so I used it for the mold. Yeah. Is that it? Thank you so much.